Hello, in this video we're going to take a look at the performance of the new Battle Royale game Apex Legends. We can start off with some bad news for those on older AMD hardware. The game does not support Phenom II CPUs at the time of testing. The game will start, but whenever one is trying to load a map, the game crashes instantly. No squads were sacrificed when benchmarking. I gathered a couple of friends, and after numerous attempts and deaths we managed to get the numbers out. I initially tried to only benchmark at the training area, as that would be much simpler, but I didn't find that it reflected the performance you would see in a server with 60 players. I benchmarked at a relay station in the game. Sadly, I forgot to record the benchmark path, so I won't be able to show you exactly where I tested. I tested all systems on max setting, and I tested the low-end settings on the minimum settings. Let's start off with looking at the specs. The systems I tested with the GTX 1070 and R9 290 were an i5 6600K at 4.8 GHz with 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory, a Ryzen R5 1600 at 3.7 GHz with 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 memory, an FX8350 with 16 GB of 1600 MHz DDR3 memory. For the low-end setup, I used the laptop with a GTX 1050 with two different CPUs, the Pentium G4620 at 3.7 GHz and the Intel i5 6600K at 3.7 GHz, both with 8 GB of 2400 MHz DDR4 memory. We start off by looking at the numbers at max settings. Here the i5 6600K is topping the chart with an average of 92.6 frames per second, a 1% low figure of 71.5 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 56.9 frames per second. Next up is the r5 1600 with an average of 86.4 frames per second, with a 1% low of 55.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 45.5 frames per second. In last place, we find the FX8350 with an average of 81.3 frames per second, with 1% low of 56 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 47.6 frames per second. Not too bad for that old chip, if we're honest. Switching to the R9 290, the R5 1600 takes the lead with an average of 58.4 frames per second, a 1% low of 44.6 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 32.7 frames per second. Following up is the i5 6600K with an average of 55.5 frames per second, a 1% low of 40.6 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 36.3 frames per second. Matching the average is the FX8350 with 55.5 frames per second. The 1% low is at 34.2 frames per second, and 0.1% low is all the way down to 20.9 frames per second. So how about the GTX 1050? Well, paired with the i5 6600K, it managed 32.4 frames per second average and 1% low of 23.2 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 20.7 frames per second. Switching to the G4620, the average fell slightly to 30.9 frames per second. However, the 1% low plummeted to 7.5 frames per second and 0.1% low to 7.4 frames per second. Now I wanted to see if we could hit 60 frames per second with the GTX 1050 at 1080p. Let's see how that went. Well, sadly we came up a bit short. The i5 6600K and Pentium G4620 managed almost identical averages as 52 and 52.6 frames per second respectively, but the 1% low was slightly better on the i5 at 36.1 frames per second to 35.2 frames per second on the Pentium. The 0.1% low was actually better on the Pentium at 34.3 frames per second. The i5 only managed 28 frames per second. That was all the numbers I had for you this time. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, remember, don't call tech support.
This is my win. Remember that.